Welcome to Learning Module Week 6C. We're going to talk about strategic sourcing in this module, which is basically when the organization really organizes completely around the obtaining of supplies and things it needs to procure from a very strategic perspective and analyzes all the possibilities and builds a structured approach and a process-oriented approach to try to optimize the entire sourcing function in the company. Here's a definition from the textbook. So, identifying ways to improve long-term business performance by better understanding sourcing needs, developing long-term sourcing strategies, selecting suppliers, and managing the supply base, which is, that's a lot of activities, isn't it? So what you'll see if you look at the diagram here is a 6-step approach. And there's different ways that companies do this, but this is a very reasonable, structured approach and a good way to understand some of the major activities that go on inside of the overall strategic sourcing process, because really it's a collection of sub-processes. So let's look through here. We'll do a quick scan here. We're going to assess opportunities and do what's called a spend analysis. We will profile markets by category, by industry, and learn about what we're buying. We'll make decisions if we should make or buy, which is a very strategic decision for a company. Should we have capabilities internally for this? Is it a core competence? Should it be a core competence? Does it help us differentiate? What is the cost comparison internally versus buying it outside? And so forth. And then after we've made that decision, if we decide we're going to purchase outside, how do we build a list of suppliers, a slate of suppliers that's capable? We don't want to buy from just anybody and everybody. We need a supplier evaluation and selection process so that when we get to that final phase, number 6, that we're able to work with a small number of suppliers and basically efficiently deal from companies that are very capable of providing us the very best value. So firms that jump way ahead to step 6 tend to pay more and be less effective in their sourcing. Firms that spend plenty of time on steps 1 through 5 tend to have a really structured, organized approach and better outcomes. So number 1, assessing opportunities. Anytime a consultant walks in the door into a new client, and it's going to have to do with spend and purchasing and so forth, one of the first things they want to either conduct or look at and check out is a spend analysis. And it means really basically what do we spend, what do we buy, and who do we buy it from, and in what quantities do we buy it, where do we buy it, in what parts of the world. It's basically given us visibility into what our spend is, because that spend is what we're trying to manage, right? It's we know we're going to buy these things. That's not the question here. It's how we do it. So we need to understand our spend well in order to be successful in the following steps of organizing how we'll do it. So 101, the first task, spend analysis. We can basically break it down most typically into one or both of the following ways. One is we can look at what's called a category. So categories can be any way that we segment our spend, into different things we buy. So we could say if we were in industrial, it might be raw materials, different types of raw materials. If we're in electromechanical assemblies, it could be parts that are designed to print, and electronics, and gears and pulleys and switches and wiring harnesses and so forth. So we can have different categories depending on what business we're in. Industry analysis would be looking at maybe in one of those categories. For example, let's say we buy electronics, having a deep understanding of electronics industry, right, as a whole, and saying what's going on in electronics. How's the growth pattern coming? Are the capacities there to enable efficient pricing in electronics? If we add certain types of materials and components into our product, are we at risk of a bottleneck where there's constrained capacity and availability where we could get hurt later? So the industry analysis can work for a lot of different ways. Is it a healthy industry? So it's really good to have some piece of both depending on their importance when we talk about, how to build this up. The make or buy decision is a very, very strategic element in the overall strategic sourcing process. And it's not over and done. We don't decide this once and say, well, back in 1972, we said we were going to buy these outside the company, so, that's written in stone. We can never talk about it again. Make or buy can be somewhat midterm type planning, or it can be mid to long term. What it's not is short term. We don't jump in and out and in and out of being vertically integrated, as it's called, and make things one week and don't make them the next, because we have to make capacity decisions, have technical know-how, and so forth. So it's a mid to long-term strategic item. At an overall, you can break it down into the insourcing, outsourcing type question. And when we say insourcing here, it's not the same as when we talked about capacity insourcing and outsourcing, where we said in the case of insourcing, we might be bringing suppliers' capacity into our organization, right? This is a different insourcing. This is insourcing that we're going to do it. We're going to bring this function. We're going to vertically integrate and make our own X instead of outsourcing that to the marketplace and buying it from another firm. Okay, so that's it. Make sure you understand the difference in capacity and in this use of insourcing when we're talking about sourcing itself, that we're talking about doing it ourselves. Okay, so a very strategic decision. We'll look at an example of how we might cost that out, just a simple advantage of it. Some of the advantages and disadvantages of insourcing and outsourcing, I like this graph because it can really give you some visualization in your mind to think, oh yeah, there are always kind of two sides to that coin. If we do it in, these are some of the positives and negatives. If we take it out, there's going to be other positives and negatives. So in general, we can say there are advantages to insourcing in that we have a high degree of control. We can now manage it. We can oversee the entire process and maybe connect processes by bringing more insourcing in. We might have a whole system-wide, deeper control of an entire process. And sometimes we can have economies of scale and or scope. Sometimes. We also may insource and lose economies of scale. So it depends on the context, right? The disadvantages. So we have reduced strategic flexibility, and this is a big deal. This is a big deal. It's companies that understand this make a better decision with insourcing and outsourcing. So having control of something can be a great thing, of course. It can be wonderful, and many times it is. It also brings us into sometimes an investment into doing something ourselves, having personnel, staff, capabilities, proprietary designs, equipment, facilities, long-term investments. And if somebody innovates around us, sometimes we're just stuck and watch on the curb catching up, right? So we need to be very clear about what value strategic flexibility from outside may have for us. What are we forfeiting when we decide to do our own whatever it is, right? If you're in, maybe an example could be if you were in consumer electronics and you had the ability to look at different video chips and screen makers and so forth, different components of your device, and you decided that you heard about an inventor and he's got some unique technology, and we're going to do all of our own video screens from now on. We're going to make a big investment into video screens, right? So maybe that goes just wonderfully for a year or two, and all of a sudden that becomes obsolete. At the speed of consumer electronics, we could all understand, because we all see this stuff just blowing by. The second you buy your next iPhone, it's already starting to smell obsolete, right? If you think about leading edge technology. So we find ourselves a year or two later where there's an innovation, a quantum leap forward, and we can't drink from that well, right? We can't go eat that Kool-Aid, that ice cream, because we got our own stuff now. And we got our capital employed, we've got plants, we got engineers that have got all this stuff built into our designs. So we've lost that strategic flexibility. Very important strategic decision, never to be taken lightly. And maybe you can understand why from that example. Okay, let's see here. So, strategic sourcing processes. So, factors that that affect that in-source, outsource. So, environmental uncertainty that favors insourcing, right? And if it becomes more certain, then it might favor outsourcing, right? Competition in the supplier market. The insourcing, it means less, right? We're going to do less of it. If there's a lot of competition in the supplier market, we're going to tend to go outside, right? And take advantage of that less expensive way and brutal markets that we can be a buyer in. Ability to monitor a supplier's performance. If we have good ability to monitor a supplier's performance, it's going to favor outsourcing again, right? That we can keep tabs on the supplier and be in tune with what they're doing and manage the process well. The relationship of the product or service to our core competencies, that's where it starts to swing more towards insourcing, right? When it's tied back to that concept of core concepts, those things we do well that are difficult for our competitors to do well, that we've built over time and that matter to our customers, the more this in-source, outsource is tied into our core competencies and so forth, the more we're going to think of it as part of our crown jewels, something to keep inside and protect. So total cost analysis is a process by which firms try to understand really deep, intimately understanding the cost of what goes into some of the products. And we need a good understanding of direct and indirect costs. So direct costs are those tied to the level of operations that really construct a product. And indirect are all those things that are more supporting, right, and enabling the direct activity to take place. When we think about insourcing and outsourcing costs, we need to understand those for sure in a very clear way. So direct material, direct labor, freight costs, variable overhead, those things that have to occur for us to build the part. In outsourcing, we'd be just be looking at a price, right? We don't think about all those direct material and labor and all that. We'd say, what's my buying price? But when we outsource, we want to know those costs so that we can do a good job of buying. Indirect costs, things such as supervising, administrative support, supplies for the plant, maintenance, utilities, building lease, and overhead. Those things are needed, but they're not directly a part of the product itself, right? Purchasing, receiving, quality control are some of the things we'd see if we were outsourcing. So in developing a sourcing strategy, if we know our costs and we've segmented out the different markets and understanding the different industries and so forth, we know what categories we buy and how much we spend, it is very useful to bracket out, and this next diagram you're going to see follows into these routine, leverage, bottleneck, and critical quadrants. And I think by talking through this, you'll see how it makes it very, very efficient for a buying organization to spend more time or less time to apply more leverage or less leverage into the negotiations of different spends. Let's define them real quick though first. So the routine quadrant, these are readily available products or services. They're a small part of our spend. They're not technical. They don't drive a huge amount of value. They're often indirect, office supplies, maybe some parts to keep the plant running properly, motors and equipment and MRO type supplies. So smaller items, pencils, paper, you got it, everything, supplies and things. And so we don't want to spend a lot of time on those things. We just want it to click like a watch. And when somebody needs a pencil, they need a pencil. We don't want to overspend on it, but we don't want to spend our lives and our purchasing organization negotiating pencils. So a lot of times we'll have electronic catalogs and so forth set up for those things that can just repeat and get paid like a clock once a month, and employees can just do their jobs and let it roll. The leverage quadrant is where we spend a lot of money and it's not really unique, highly strategic items. So these would be things like if you were in a manufacturing firm and you needed to buy injection molding and stampings that were within reasonable quality tolerances, where there's lots of suppliers that you could choose from who are able to do a quality job, have the capacity, are in the right locations and so forth, then we apply leverage, right? These are not as strategic of relationships as some of ours will probably be. They're important. They're long-term. We don't want just anybody in there. They need to be very capable suppliers, but we're going to apply a lot of leverage and not spend too much because we can buy from lots of different companies. The bottleneck quadrant is where we're not important really to the supplier, and it's fairly technical or unique. And so there aren't a lot of suppliers. It's a restricted supply chain, maybe a more technical product and so forth, and us maybe just not buying enough of it to build leverage, right? And so it's a quadrant we'd like to not be in because we could be taken advantage of as buyers in this case. Power transferred over to the supplier when we engineered this bottleneck component or technology into our product. So we prefer to avoid the bottleneck quadrant, but sometimes the market and what we want to do for our consumers pulls us in there anyway. The critical quadrant, also sometimes called the strategic quadrant, the most special quadrant is where we want to have very selective and strategic relationships with certain suppliers where we have long-term contracts, sharing of technology, probably maybe some people at each other's sites working close together in teams, maybe sharing intellectual property, some certain contracts and legal status and so forth. So these are the tightest relationships. We want them to endure long-term. They probably are technical like the bottleneck quadrant, only they work for us. We've got enough volume that we matter to those suppliers and they matter to us, and we can work out a long-term win-win type relationship. Let's look at a graph that puts those quadrants into picture. This is a famous model, Kraljich's purchasing matrix, and versions of it are used in purchasing organizations all around the world. So after you've segmented out your suppliers and you've looked at your spend and so forth, it's very common to start mapping suppliers into these areas. So what you would probably do is take a category and say, okay, is that category a bottleneck? Oh, can we get out of that bottleneck? Can we work with engineering and use another technology that would get us over here where we have some leverage, where we're not at such a risk? Or are they strategic? And which few firms do we want to be strategic with? One firm? Two firms? Four firms? What's the right number of suppliers, right, for this strategic component? And how do we lay out those long-term relationships and invest in those? And down here, probably for most firms, a large percentage of the spend, right, is here. It's those things we know we need to buy. We buy a lot of it, right? This side of the graph is purchase volumes and impact, right? So it means we're spending a lot of money on this side of the graph. But these are less strategic for us, and we can apply more leverage. We're not as interested in 5 and 10-year relationships with these suppliers. They need to perform. They're entitled to some profit, but we're not going to lock in as much to suppliers in this category. We're going to apply leverage, maintain enough suppliers so that we can competitively bid every time that we source into those categories, and have enough bids that we have a truly market represented price and never a price that represents getting too cozy with a supplier. The last supply category, is this non-critical items, and it's an area that companies just don't want to spend time on, as I said earlier. It's the everything from the soap and the toilet paper to the mops to the little small parts that keep the machines running, paper, pencils, calculators, travel services. And what firms like to do in this area is say, well, we need to be efficient. It can be a significant amount of the total spend. It could be 2%, 3%, 10%. It could be 20% of your total spend. But it needs to be usually managed in a way that's efficient. So we'll hook into travel portals, negotiate with a travel service, and make it just streamlined for our employees to know that we're getting a good price, we have an efficient process, and we can pay those bills and audit it out, once a month and click, click, click. Same thing with office supplies. We usually would get into electronic catalogs, negotiate the best deals we can with those companies that specialize in that area, and make it easy when our company needs paper, pencils, cleaning supplies, that we can just get them, right? And not issue purchase orders and negotiate a price every time, right? It just needs to flow. So it's worth spending considerable time in the non-critical area on a setup sense. It's not worth spending considerable time there on an ongoing sense. We want to set it up so the transactions can just efficiently flow and so forth. Okay, so one of the things we would do then, once we've mapped out where we want to go and how we see our supply chain strategically, for example, through that matrix, is we would decide how we handle each category. What is our strategy now for this category? Do we want 5 suppliers, 2 suppliers, 1 supplier, 24 suppliers? How does it look, and how is it today, and how do we want it to look? If we could take a clean sheet of paper and had none of the baggage of all these source decisions we've made for the last 20 years, what would it look like? What would be the ideal state? And over time, we can work towards whatever that ideal state is. It might take 5 or 10 years because we have long, you don't just turn on a dime with your supply chain. But we can move towards the state that we want. Do we want dual sourcing, cross-sourcing, single sourcing, multiple sourcing? So, there's different benefits to each of these, right? So you can take these 2 right here, single source and multiple source, and say that makes up most of our relationships. Most of our relationships are probably going to have multiple sources, right? The more we move towards strategic, the more we're going to basically get into dual source and single source. Sometimes we want 2 sources because it protects us from supply chain risk. When we have 1 source and all our eggs are in 1 basket, we can negotiate a wonderful price. We can get technology sharing agreements. We can have a lot of collaboration. So we almost have a joint venture, right? We're really working close with this company. It becomes a single point of failure too. So we can move from single source to dual source and say, well, we've mitigated some risk. Now we can bid this out a little bit more, and we can kind of counterbalance these 2 suppliers with each other, right? And the one that gives us a little better business, maybe it becomes 60-40 in their favor. And 3 or 4 years from now, maybe it goes the other way. We can apply some leverage and have a little the best of the both worlds there. Multiple sourcing is really that leverage model. And cross-sourcing is basically saying we use a single supplier for 1 part or service and another supplier with the same capabilities for a different part, right? So cross-sourcing means I have part A and part B in 1 category, and I'm going to single source part A one place, and I'm going to single source part B another place, right? To keep multiple suppliers active, but only tool and engineer that and work out an actual supplier validation for 1 source on the actual part. Lots of cross-sourcing gets done. Okay, so the screening suppliers and so forth. So we need some system of criteria to basically filter through who should be on our supplier panel. So you might find hundreds of companies in the Midwest, for example, that could build you certain types of parts. We're a manufacturing area of the world. There's lots of manufacturing, and we could easily find way more suppliers than we want to know about. How do we filter that out, right? So we need to basically look at a system. Oh, sorry, I got to finish that first. How we filter that out is basically setting up some criteria that can represent the minimum basis. We could call these the order qualifiers, right? Who's got capacity, a decent financial statement, the right press sizes, if we're buying stampedes, the right equipment and capital. Do we need engineering capabilities? So we can reduce the big list down to a smaller list by saying, what are the triggers that would let us filter this down? The supplier selection system is a way to go to a more granular view, right? And to use weighting of different criterias and to take now, let's say if we're down to 25 suppliers and we only want 5 on our actual bid list, right? We might use a more detailed request for information, an RFI, and start learning a deeper level of detail about the capabilities, the profiles, the locations, the capacities, and all of those other things, but at a more detailed level, something that we could actually score. All right, and we'll take a look at an example of that here. So if we had Electra Company here, and they're looking to buy, sign a contract for 500,000 integrated circuit boards. There's a number of different suppliers that have the capacity and have the equipment to be able to build that. But we basically want to summarize down what performance of 3 possible suppliers would be in regard to price, quality, and delivery. And we basically look at their performance, right? A performance dimension, and what the performance is on those criteria. And we could turn those performance into a numerical value to let us apply a mathematical model to this, right? So if we say, well, the criteria, price, quality, and delivery is worth, 30%, 40%, and 30%. Notice the total is always 100, right, of those weights, or 100 and 1 being the same thing. 1.0 equals 100%. And a scoring scheme, 1 through 5 in this case. So we're going to say, well, each of them did, somewhere between excellent with a 5 and poor with a 1 for each of those criteria. So we're going to weight the criteria and say how important price, quality, and delivery is. And then we're going to score each of the companies on those 3 criteria using a 1 through 5 scale. So by doing that, we can basically see now we've got a representation of their capabilities, right, on the scoring. So we gave them their 1 through 5, price. This means their price is good. So a large number being a good thing in this scale. You remember that 5 was excellent. And then we see here that, Beverly Hills is more expensive because they have a lower number for the price rating. And the best price is with Conan the electrician, right? And for quality, though, old Conan's just not up to snuff. He's actually terrible, and he's also very unreliable. So Conan's got a great name and a great price, but they don't do anything right. The Aardvark here, we've got a high price, good performance overall on quality and reliability. And with Beverly Hills, we've got a mid-level, an even higher price, great performance on quality, not very reliable on their delivery. So let's see what it looks like when we actually put the weights against those, right? So we can score those performance ratings times the weight, and we get a complete score for Aardvark of 3.6. And Beverly Hills, with their fantastic quality, their price is a little high and their reliability is low. They didn't quite keep up with old Aardvark there. And then poor old Conan here that he's got the cheapest thing in town, but he can't seem to do anything right. So he's got a 2.2. So what do you learn from that if you're a buyer, right? Aardvark should improve their quality. And you'd be talking to Aardvark about that, saying, you guys, your price is a little bit high. Your price was reasonable. Your quality could improve a bit. And let's see. I should have kept the titles on these. It was price, quality, delivery. Okay. So price is good. Yeah. Okay. Quality is a 3. It needs to go up. And delivery is fine. They should work on their quality. Yeah. And what about old Beverly here? Well, you're a little bit expensive for some people that can't deliver, right? So they should work on their delivery, and maybe they can get away with the price if they could just deliver, because they got the commanding lead in quality, right? And Conan, you're just not meeting the deal. You're probably going to be taken off the bid list. If there's no reason to believe that Conan's going to get their act together, they're probably going to come off the bid list. So what are our options then as a buyer? So we could award the contract to Aardvark after detailed negotiating, showing how they're going to improve their quality, right? So that could be an option if we really believe in their plans, and we probably would have follow-up plans and a regular report out once a month or something on how they're doing it and how we're never going to see poor quality issues coming out of that premium price. And we could award to Beverly Hills after a detailed negotiation, which we asked Beverly Hills to reduce their price and talk about what they're going to do about delivery, right? So maybe we can get the price down and then also find out, hey guys, we can't have delivery issues. How are you going to approach that? That cannot happen. How can we be sure? And dual sourcing, we could always split it between the two if that makes sense strategically for us. If it doesn't bring us on a lot of extra development costs or whatever other negative repercussions come from a dual source, we might be able to dual source if it's low investment and if it warrants, right? Okay. So finally, implementing agreements. So with competitive bidding of a product, we basically say that we have something we can define that the customer can understand, and that through an RFQ, a request for quotation, we can send out what's really a legal document asking for a bid, and return from that is a formal quote, which also is a legal document delivering a bid. Those are not taken lightly in organizations because they are binding to the extent that the UCC and also the terms and conditions of buyer and seller make them binding. So they're thought of as binding. They're not sent out saying, well, we'll just send this and we can always revise it next week. No, you can't just revise it next week. So they can be binding contracts, the beginning of a binding contract when we quote. Different industries and specifications, performance characteristics all go into these bids, right? So there's a lot of information, technical information and specifications, things about tolerances, sizes, dimensions, weights, materials. They're very specific when you get an RFQ. And they have to be so that you know exactly what you're quoting, right? Negotiation is part of the process often. It takes a lot of time to negotiate, and it's used usually when we have something that is complex enough that between the parts and the services that we're buying and the amount of money that we're going to transact, that it's worth the negotiating process. So buyers are normally and sellers are normally very well trained in the negotiation process. And it's interesting. If you ever have the chance to take a negotiation class, I would encourage anybody to do that, because we all are buyers and sellers, whether we work in purchasing or not. We buy and sell all the time in life. And it's unfortunate to be on the other side of somebody who's very good, professional, and not understand some of the process of negotiations. But anyway, when it's new or a technically complex item, when the purchase agreement is basically a wide range of performance factors, when the buyer requires the supplier to participate in the development efforts, so there's a lot of upfront investment on the seller's side, and when the supplier cannot determine all the risks and costs without additional input from the buyer. Those are 4 common items of why these negotiation processes get started, and they're a part of most industrial buying. The contracting process, so there's, at the end of a source decision, we make contracts, right? And it's usually called a purchase order, right? We issue a purchase order, and that is finalizing an agreement between all of the bids and offers and so forth. The purchase order represents offer acceptance. It's a very common known legal document. The purchase order itself gets pulled into court if there's a big dispute. And in contracting, in doing so, we have 2 common breakdowns of that. One is a fixed price contract and one is a cost-based contract. Basically, a fixed price contract is when it's stated that this is the price. It's not going to change. The seller accepts the risk and the reward of variation in cost, right? It's a fixed price for the duration of whatever period of time. A cost-based contract can basically move at certain times, certain pre-specified times, could be daily, monthly, quarterly, annually, can be whenever it's specified, but it will make adjustments in price up and down, right? So then the buyer is taking on the risk or the reward of changes in certain predetermined costs. An example could be if you were a stamping company, and we're going to look at a little quick example of stamping in a little while, so I'll use that example now. And you had signed fixed price contracts with your customers, and the steel market is moving up or down. You're earning more and you're earning less as it moves past the threshold that you based your quotation on. When steel becomes more expensive, you lose profits. When steel becomes more affordable, you gain profits. If you had that same contract and you went to a cost-based with the same customer, but just say it's a cost-based contract, now your selling price will move up and down with the cost of that steel, and the customer is going to enjoy a lower, or suffer a higher price as steel goes up and down. So important to remember those. You should know them for the exam. Fixed price contract and cost-based contracts. In summary, strategic sourcing requires firms to look at many, many possibilities, some long-term strategic possibilities, understanding their full spend, and starting to develop some criteria around how to segment suppliers and how to segment the spend. Category and industry analysis allows firms to explore those possibilities and to become expert buyers, not looking for just what a price might be quoted, but what's the cost underlying it? And what are the risks and non-risk areas underlying it with capacity, with location, with disruption, with weather, with all these different things. So very important in strategic sourcing is to have the staff that can be capable of really understanding the parts, the markets, the suppliers at an intimate level. Category and industry analysis allow us to do that. Make versus buy is sometimes a consequence of that deeper understanding where we say, should we do this ourselves, where we have certain strategic advantages and disadvantages of choosing to insource this and have this be a part of our, vertically integrate this into our processes? Or should we have it in the marketplace where we have choices between different technologies, maybe lower investment, maybe higher or lower total cost, etc., right? So understanding those trade-offs, not just the cost, but definitely understanding the cost, but beyond the cost, also understanding, deeper implications for these long-term make or buy or strategic decisions. Analytical tools can help firm to understand costs. Cost is more powerful than price in the long term because if we know cost, we know what it should. We call it should cost. What a part's should cost would be. It means we can model what a typical supplier has to do to build that part, and we can understand when we're getting a fair price. We don't have to just battle to figure out where the bottom is because we need our suppliers to earn a reasonable profit. Now, we don't want it to be too big, right? But we don't want them to be at a loss or they create a whole new risk. Doing business with companies that go out of business is a very expensive proposition. So we can prepare a slate of capable suppliers that have, solid financials. We can do requests for information and learn more and more about companies to try to narrow who should be on our supplier panel, and then use RFQs, requests for quotes, to take the small number of suppliers who are approved and authorized and conduct structured sourcing decisions. The negotiation and contracting are the final step, and firms that rush to that final step are usually very poor at sourcing overall. They just cut right to the chase and send some bids out, but they didn't have a strategy behind what they're doing. Maybe they should insource. Maybe they never even looked into who their suppliers should be. Maybe they source to suppliers that give the lowest price, but the supplier's not capable, and it ends in tears, right? It ends in disasters where we're, oh boy, having a whole real rodeo that I hope all of you can avoid. We don't want to be good at crazy business to be in. We want to be good at sourcing to excellent suppliers that are going to serve us for years. That concludes a brief discussion on strategic sourcing. We packed a lot in there, but I think you'll get a feel for how the strategic functions come down to those tactical sourcing functions through that discussion. I hope you enjoyed it, and that ends our lecture.